group is one of considerable size. Today we know that it's 1/3 of the student population. And because here, faulty teaching methods may not only prevent the acquisition of academic education by children of average capacity, but may also give rise to far-reaching damage to their emotional life. Well, that was pretty clear. Now you might ask, well, perhaps or you might say that perhaps the professors didn't read this article. What they had to was published in their own journal. The Journal of Educational Psychology was being published by the very same professors who were creating this new method of teaching. So they had full warning. They had full warning that this method of teaching would cause widespread reading disability. They were warned, but they went right ahead and put the books in the schools. And no sooner were the books in the schools than America began to have a reading problem. And of course, the nation had to wait until 1955 before it found out why it was having a reading problem. And the educators were told again, this method causes reading disabilities. And what did they do with Dr. Rudolph Flesch? They vilified him, they castigated him, they criticized him, they denounced him, they did everything in their power to destroy the effectiveness of his book by Johnny Campion. And then they created the International Reading Association, which had become the world's largest professional organization for the teachers of reading. And that organization has been riding herd on the teachers of America all these years, making sure that they use this method of teaching. That's why it's still in the schools today. Incidentally, they don't have dyslexia in Russia. They don't have functional illiteracy in Russia. Do you know that John Dewey, when he visited Russia in the early 1920s, he sold Lenin's wife on the Luxay method. And they used the Luxay method in Russia until 1932, and then they threw it out and went back to phonics. And that's why they don't have dyslexia in the Soviet Union. They can't understand why America has a reading problem. I can prove it to you. Somebody sent me a Xerox copy from the Soviet Encyclopedia, the English edition. Here's the article. The article is Prima, a textbook designed to teach reading and writing, a primary handbook for developing language and logical thinking in children. The teaching of reading and writing is accomplished by various methods: the syllabic method, the phonetic method, the whole words method, and so on. The corresponding primers are written for each method. The phonetic analytic synthetic method, which is the basis on which Soviet primers are compiled, is the most feasible method of teaching reading and writing. That's what they're telling us. And then they say, the first Soviet primers compiled according to the so-called whole words method were replaced in 1932 by primers in which the analytic synthetic sound method was revived. Since then, all primers have been compiled according to this method. So the Soviets tried it. They saw it didn't work, and they went back to phonics, and that's why everybody in the Soviet Union has learned to read. And that's been their undoing. High literacy is what's causing the problems now in the Soviet Union. They can all read. I have a feeling that Gorbachev is not going to go back to Luxay. But isn't it interesting how our educators were so fascinated by everything that goes on in the Soviet Union, you know, with all these exchanges taking place? The one thing they're not interested in is how the Soviets teach their children to read. They're interested in everything else but that. And you never hear about that. Very interesting, particularly our psychologists. Now you might ask, why are our educators doing this? Well, I asked that question myself many years ago when I first got involved. I said, why are they subjecting children to this ridiculous method of teaching? At first I thought it was stupidity. I thought these professors were stupid. Then I realized that these were not stupid men. These men had created the graduate schools of education. They had created the graduate schools of psychology. They were giving out PhDs to everyone else, and they were not stupid then. Then I thought maybe it was greed. And I'll tell you how I came to that idea. When I was writing The New Illiterates, I made a very interesting discovery. I discovered that to teach children to read by the alphabetic phonics method is very simple and very inexpensive. As a matter of fact, if you go back to the old primers that were published in the 1820s and 30s, and I'm sure some of you have seen them in antiquarian book fairs, you will find that the little primers were tiny little books that you could slip in your pocket. But to teach a child to read by the look-say method, you need a stack of books 4 feet high. Why? Well, you see, you're teaching children to memorize words as pictures, and so in the first book they learn the first 20 words, and then the second book, the first 20 words are incorporated, and they add more words, and then the third book incorporates the words of the first 2 books, and then they add more words, and this goes on infinitum, and they're stuck in this set of words. The only way that they can learn to read is by memorizing these words. If they come across words that they've never seen before, they're sunk, you see. So they are trapped in what is known as a controlled vocabulary. Incidentally, the teacher's manuals, you ought to see them, these teacher's manuals. The Houghton Mifflin primer for the children is a tiny book with, maybe a dozen words in it, but the teacher's manual is about 500 pages. She needs 500 pages to teach, 25 words. 500 pages of instruction. So I thought to myself, what clever, man. They took the simplest and cheapest thing in elementary education and made it the most complicated and expensive thing. And they made millions of dollars in royalties. They laughed all the way to the bank. Do you know how many copies of Dick and Jane were sold in this country? Or Janet and Mark? Or a half dozen other such primers? So I thought to myself, well, that's it. They were, greed. Then I thought to myself, well, that can't be the full explanation, because after all, these men are long since gone. They're dead. The method has been discredited, thoroughly shown to be faulty, and yet teachers, the educators, cling to it. You can't get it out of their hands. Every time you want to try to get intensive phonics in an American school, it's like trying to break down the Berlin Wall. It's impossible. You go to the state legislatures, you try to get them to mandate intensive phonics, all of a sudden the educators come out of the woodwork to oppose you. And I thought, there's something behind this. And I remember a friend of mine who was involved with me in the Reading Reform Foundation. She was convinced that there was a plot to destroy the blacks in America through this method. I said, that's preposterous. Conspiracies? Come on. Well, when I started writing my book on the NEA, I said to myself, I'm going to finally get to the bottom of this. I'm going to find out who were the men who instigated this and what was in their minds. Well, I found out that the men who were the originators of all of this were known as the progressives. Now, who were the progressives? There were a new breed of educator that came on the scene around the turn of the century. And what distinguished them from their predecessors is that they were members of the Protestant academic elite who no longer believed in the religion of their fathers. They rejected Christianity, they rejected the Bible, they rejected God, they rejected Jesus Christ, and now they put all their faith in science, evolution, and psychology. To them, science provided the answers to the material world. Evolution, of course, explained the origin of man. You didn't need the biblical explanation. That was myth. That was fairy tale. Man arose out of the primordial ooze like the rest of the creatures. Just a bunch of animals. And, of course, psychology now provided them with a scientific means to study human nature. And also a scientific means to control human behaviors. They said, we've got it all. Now, these men were also socialists. Now, why were they socialists? I mean, you can be an atheist without being a socialist, but why were they socialists? Well, These men were very concerned about the problem of evil. And they rejected the biblical explanation for where evil comes from. Why do men do the horrible things they do? Well, the Bible tells us man is sinful by nature. Disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden. Has passed on this disobedient, sinful nature to the rest of humanity. And we've had to live with this horrible, sinful nature. In other words, evil is the result of man's nature. It's not something floating in the air. It comes out of us. Whatever evil is in the world is the result of human frailty. Catholics call it original sin. John Calvin called it innate depravity or total depravity. Now what did Calvin mean by that? He meant that when men reject God, reject his commandments, reject his laws, and decide to live according to their own passions, their own will, their own desires, then whatever depravity they can think of, they will do. They will perform. And of course we've had more than enough confirmation of that in the 20th century. Now, the Bible presents us with this horrible problem of evil, but it also provides a solution. We're told, yes, man, you do have this sinful nature, but you can still lead a happy, productive, and long life, provided that you live according to God's laws, that you obey his commandments, that you live according to the guidelines set down in the Bible. If you do that, you can lead a very nice, long, happy, productive life. And if you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, your sins will be forgiven. You will be saved and you will have eternal life after death. Well, that's a magnificent solution to a pretty horrible problem. Well, now, if you reject all of that as mythology, as fairy tale, you've got to come up with your own explanation. Where does evil come from? Why do men do the horrible things they do? Well, these great scientific minds said, well, we know what causes evil. It has nothing to do with sinful nature. There is no God anyway, so there's no such thing as sin. You can't disobey something that doesn't exist. We know what causes evil. It's caused by ignorance, poverty, and social injustice. That's it. And what causes social injustice? Well, it's this horrible economic system of ours called capitalism. Individualism causes social injustice because individualists are selfish people. And of course, religion causes evil because if you go around telling people that they're sinful by nature, well, you know the power of suggestion. They're going to act sinfully. So they said, if we want to get rid of evil in the world, if we want to have a perfect society, if we want to have human beings behaving like pussycats, we've got to get rid of capitalism, individualism, and religion, and replace them with socialism, collectivism, and atheism or humanism. Now these men then embarked on a messianic mission to change America from a capitalist, individualistic, believing nation into a socialist, collectivist, atheist nation. Now why did they embark on this messianic mission? Well, you see, these men, all of them, came from good Christian families. John Dewey taught Sunday school as a youngster. James McKean Cattell's father was a Presbyterian minister. Others had fathers who were ministers and fathers who were missionaries. They all knew their Bibles very well. They knew their religion very well. And they were determined to prove that they were right and the Bible was wrong. Why? Because if they were wrong and the Bible was right, they knew where they'd be going. So they had this incredibly strong spiritual motivation to prove that they were right and the Bible was wrong. And how could they do that? By bringing about socialism. Because they were convinced that if they brought about socialism, they would prove once and for all that man was basically good, that you could have utopia, and that evil was caused by the conditions in which men lived, by ignorance, poverty, and social injustice, and had nothing to do with this other mythological business. And that's why they embarked on this messianic mission, and that's why we're still in it. There are still plenty of people in America who don't believe in God, you know. plenty of humanists who deny the existence of God and still believe in this utopian vision. Incidentally, John Dewey and the others did not get their vision of socialism from Karl Marx. They got it from an American by the name of Edward Bellamy, who wrote a rather interesting book in 1888 entitled Looking Backward. In that book, Bellamy projected a fantasy of a socialist America in the year 2000. And so if you want to know what their actual vision was, what kind of a society they wanted, just read that book. There's a blueprint. Now, these men were determined to change America into a socialist society. How were they going to do it? They knew that American adults were not about to give up their private property, their religions, their individualism. So they said, well, we'll have to work on the children. And we'll have to create a curriculum that will make the children into little socialists. And they will change the system. They will get rid of capitalism, individualism, and religion, and they will create this new society. So they said, well, what kind of a curriculum shall we have in the schools? Well, John Dewey got to work in his laboratory school at the University of Chicago. He spent 6 years working on a new curriculum for the schools. At the end of that time, he put his findings in a little book called School and Society. Now, what did he propose? He said, well, what we've got to do is this. If we want to create this little socialism, what we have to do is downgrade the development, the teaching of the language, the literacy, and the intellectual skills, the academic skills, and then we've got to put the emphasis on the development of the social skills, socialization, behavior, values, activities, group think, group decision-making, social studies. Today we call that the affective domain. All of those things that they teach in the schools that are involved with socialization, the changing of values, etc., is called the affective domain. Now, why did they feel that they had to downgrade literacy and language study? Well, you see, John Dewey was a highly intelligent man. He spent years analyzing the capitalist system, the religious system, and he said, Eureka, I know what the culprit is. The culprit behind the sustenance of those systems is high literacy. This incredible emphasis on language study. Why? Because language study and high literacy produces individuals with this independent intelligence who are not interested in the collective. You see. These are people who can stand on their own 2 feet and think for themselves. They don't need an elite at the top that's going to tell them what to do. And in a socialist society, that's what you have, as in the communist country. You've got the Communist Party at the top that tells everybody else what to do. And that's how he envisioned society, an academic elite of the progressives at the top, and everybody else, you know. He said, yes, you can have a kind of functional literacy, a kind of lower level literacy that people can use. But forget about this high literacy. That's the culprit. We don't want people who can curl up in a corner with a book and forget the collective, be quite satisfied. That produces selfishness. We want people who will be socially involved, collectively involved. And he said, you have to lower the level of literacy. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, now, these men, besides being America's leading educators, were also America's top behavioral psychologists. They put their minds to the task and they said, Eureka, we will teach children to read English as if it were Chinese. That will do the job. And that's exactly what they did. I wish I had time to go into the details of that whole plan and show you how they did it so cleverly, so well thought out. They spent days, months, years planning this. Do you know how long it took to plan all of this? The meetings they had to do all of this? And finally, of course, the books were ready by also educated new superintendents, and most of the older superintendents were out and got the books in the schools. And to prove to you, and incidentally, they also were psychologists who had been doing all of they believed that children were little animals, products of evolution, and they did all of their experiments with animals. Edward L. Thorndike did his experiments with chickens. He thought that he could learn a lot about how children learn by studying chickens. Pavlov did his experiments with dogs. You've all heard of the Pavlov dog. He developed the most sophisticated techniques of conditioning through his experiments with dogs. John B. Watson did his experiments with rats, and his disciple, B.F. Skinner, also experimented with rats. As a matter of fact, B.F. Skinner believed that there was not much of a difference between human beings and rats. Now, there may not be much of a difference between B.F. Skinner and a rat. I believe that there's a difference between human beings and rats. But to prove to you that the method that they're using is based on animal training, let me read to you a description of the look-same method given by Professor Walter Dearborn of Harvard University, one of those progressives, who wrote this in an article in 1940. He said, "The principle which we have used to explain the acquisition of a sight vocabulary is, of course, the one suggested by Pavlov's well-known experiments on the conditioned response. This is as it should be. The basic process involved in conditioning and in learning to read is the same." In other words, Dr. Dearborn is telling us that we teach children to read as if they were little dogs. Now, when a little dog enters first grade, what can the little dog say? Arf, arf, right? Now let us assume that our little dog, our little canine friend then stays in school and socially promoted right through the 12th grade, reaches that momentous occasion at graduation, trots out to the stage to receive his diploma, pulls out his paw, looks up into the eyes of the principal, and what can that little doggy say? Arf, arf. 12 years, that dog hasn't learned a single word. But a human child starts teaching himself to speak his own language virtually at birth, so that by the time he's ready to go to school, he has developed a speaking vocabulary in thousands of words. Isn't that incredible? Do you know that every human child has this incredible language learning energy? And every normal child teaches himself to speak his own language all by himself, without the help of Sesame Street, without the help of clowns jumping out of garbage cans, without the help of Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, all by themselves. And by the time they're ready to go to school, these kids feel very intelligent. Why? They are intelligent. When you see a little youngster that high, speaking perfect English, perfect syntax, just talking away, that's a miracle. And incidentally, only human beings have that power. Only human children have it. The animals, the other species, don't have that power of language. They don't have that language learning energy. Only human beings have it. Why? Well, because God wanted to communicate with us. He made us in His image. And He wanted a means of communicating with us, and He gave us the power of language. You know what it says in the Bible? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So God gave us the power of the Word so that He could communicate with us, and we could communicate back with Him through the Word, through prayer. And that's why the Word is so important. Now, of course, the behavioral psychologists, they poo-poo human language. They say, "Oh, come on, come off it. What are you making such a fuss about human language? It's no more than a slightly more evolutionary developed form of bow-wow, or meow, or chirp-chirp. It's just animal talk. A little more developed, that's all that human language is." As a matter of fact, they're convinced that the only reason why monkeys can't speak is because they've been culturally deprived. So they've actually had monkeys living among human families to see if they would learn to talk. But I'm afraid the monkeys didn't do much better than our little dog friend, our little canine friend. Monkeys will never be able to speak because God did not make them. He only gave human beings that power. So here's our little Johnny. He's now ready to go to school. He's taught himself to speak some language. He figured, gee, I could do that. I could certainly learn to read. So he goes off to school, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, full of expectations. But he doesn't know that his teacher is using the Dick and Jane method. So he enters school, and this is what he's taught to read by sight. In the first grade, he's taught to read this. Dick, look, Jane, look, look, see Dick, see, oh, see Dick, oh, see Dick, oh, funny Dick. Some youngster sits there and he says, gee, I'm crazy or shit's crazy. This is stupid. This is stupid. Oh, look, see. This is weird. School's a weird place, but, Mother has told me to behave myself, so I will do the best I can. You see, he knows that this is stupid. How many people here read this and knew it was stupid? You weren't fooled, were you? Johnny isn't fooled, but what choice does he have, you see? He thinks, well, this is the way they do things. Crazy, but do the best I can. But at the end of the year, he's doing very poorly, you see. Maybe he's one of the 1/3 identified by Dr. Horton as those who have problems learning to read this way. And so Mother is called to school and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a reading problem. We shall have to keep him back a year. So here's Johnny, who felt so intelligent in September. By June, he's thinking to himself, gee, I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm dumb. And then at the end of that second year, things don't improve. As a matter of fact, they get even worse. And Mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, Johnny has a learning disability. Johnny is dyslexic. We shall have to put him in special education. Well, by now, Mother is absolutely frantic. She's wondering if she's given birth to a defective child. And they're all wondering, what's wrong with Johnny? Not what's wrong with the way they're teaching, but what's wrong with Johnny? What has he got? Minimal brain damage, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, symbolia, attention deficit syndrome. And, they're testing him all over the place. And they're wondering, well, it may very well be an allergy. Perhaps he's eating too many Twinkies or drinking too much Pepsi-Cola. There's something wrong with Johnny. Johnny's now going around saying, I'm stupid, I'm dumb, I can't learn, I'm dyslexic. He's already adjusting to his new status in life, being stupid, dyslexic. And so he goes into special ed. And if you know anything about special ed, you can imagine what a year of special education will do to our little Johnny. By the end of that year, he's become a little monster in the classroom. He's driving the teacher absolutely crazy. He's swinging from the rafters. See, in addition to being taught to read by this ridiculous method, he's also been told that he's a little animal. He's a product of evolution. He's been taken to the zoo to visit his cousins, the monkeys, and to say hello to his uncle, the gorilla. And he sees them swinging merrily from the bars, and he says, I can do that. I'm a little animal, too. So he's, driving the teacher crazy. And so Mother is called to school again and told, Mrs. Jones, if Johnny is to remain in school, he will have to take medication. So back to the doctors they go, and of course the doctor recommends their favorite behavioral modification drug known as Ritalin. And in a very short time, Johnny is reduced to the status of a little zombie in the classroom, destined to a life as a functional. Now that scenario goes on all over America. Every school district, there are these little Johnnies who are condemned. As a matter of fact, this very September, 1/3 of those youngsters who entered public schools, the first grade, this September, will go and have their brains turned into macaroni in a year's time. Intelligent, normal kids who have taught themselves to speak their own language will suddenly find out that they can't learn. They are learning disabled. There's something wrong with them. They're crippled. And it'll all have been done by the school. And the kids will bear the blame. And the parents will believe that there's something wrong with the kids. The parents will insist you're not listening to the teacher.